Hello, and welcome to Mental Health Matters Podcast. I'm your host, Liz Lang, and I'm here with Dr. Mark Burton. In this podcast, we will talk about all things mental health. Thank you so much for joining us. Hello, everyone. Liz Lang here with Dr. Mark Burton. And this week, we are going to be talking about building positive relationships with teens. So this topic stems as lately I have been contemplating my own relationship with my parents as a teenager. And my parents are very wonderful people who gave me an extraordinary childhood. I was very fortunate in that I always had everything that I needed. I had stability as a child, and I always
is really important.
It
Stability.
is.
Yeah.
Yes, I never knew what it was like to go without as a child. And I'm always grateful to my parents for that. And I had a pretty good relationship with my dad as a teenager, but for whatever reason, and maybe this made my parents a really good parenting team, my mom is fabulous with young children, but she's a little bit clueless with teenagers. And my dad's the opposite. My dad is kind of clueless with young kids. Or when we were young kids, he's kind of like, I don't know what to do with you. Go ask your mom. So they kind of balance each other out that way.
Can I ask you a question about that? I'm just wondering what it was about your mom that made you think she was clueless. Was it behavior? Was it what she said to you?
Okay, so for a long time, I couldn't figure it out. And I didn't like my mother as a teenager. And I tried to be respectful. I don't think I was very good at it. But she drove me nuts as a teenager. And for years, I couldn't figure out why. And when I had kids, like everything in life does, it changed. And my mom and I are extremely close now, and we talk all the time. We can talk about anything, but she drove me nuts as a teenager. And I finally realized she was overbearing is what it was. And it's not that she meant to be overbearing. She just really wanted to have a good relationship. She wanted to be involved in her lives. She had good intentions, but it just came across as very much overbearing. And so we naturally just pushed away from it.
Overbearing in that she wanted to be too involved, or she wanted to tell you what to do?
Too involved, I think. She wanted to be that mom that was best friends with her teenager.
More of a friend. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Not that she didn't provide guidelines and set boundaries and set rules. Like, she very much was a parent first, but she also wanted to be the mom that was a friend with the teenager. She wanted both. And that doesn't always work well with kids. In fact, it very rarely works well with teenagers from what I've seen. Well, I don't know, maybe it does. But I mean, she definitely went about it the right way in that providing us guidelines, boundaries, and rules was more important to her than having us like her. And that is key in parenthood.
Well, I think that's actually pretty good. That's
right. So,
yeah.
I mean, she did a good job. It's just sometimes she would be overbearing, and we've talked about it, and she recognizes it, and it's all water under the bridge now. I mean, we have that friendship now that she's always wanted. So, I mean, overall, I am nothing but grateful to my parents for all that they provided for me as a teenager. But as I'm raising my own kids, I really would like to have a better relationship with my kids. And I already have some ideas, and I'm already implementing some things. But I know that probably the biggest factor is going to be starting early. You have to start before they're a teenager.
And we can talk about that, what that looks like, because I agree with you.
Yeah. So let's start there then. Talk about what that looks like, or how you start when they're young.
I think that you've said a couple of really important things. Stability is really important in kids of all ages. And so if you think about, raising children, so young children, what you want to do is to be able to give them those guidelines and kind of have, I guess you might call it, a tighter rein. Now, it's hard because we aren't visual here, but I'm going to try and describe this. There's this thing called the V of love. And what it is, if you could picture a triangle with the point facing down, and the area inside the triangle represents the amount of control a child has through the
Mm-hmm.
lifespan. So down at the bottom, at the point is the birth of the child, has no control, whatsoever.
Right.
And as you go up, the triangle goes out and you have more area in the triangle, which represents you have more control in your life. And so I think one of the ways that you prepare is you really set, I don't know if you call them strict guidelines, but we've talked about parenting and having clear expectations, clear
Mm-hmm.
consequences or rewards and the follow through. And I think that's really important because one, it gives children stability and it gives them safety.
Mm-hmm.
But then what happens is as they start to get older, realistically, we start to lose control.
Yeah.
And they're at school, especially when they drive or they go off with friends. And so we lose that control typically to impose some stricter boundaries, although we may need to. But the problem is, like if you invert that so that the fat end of the triangle is facing down and you give your young children really a lot of control,
Mm-hmm.
and then when they're 15, you try and then teach them, okay, I'm the one in charge and I'm going to put these boundaries on. It doesn't work.
Hmm.
It's actually the model, if you think about it, of our prison system. We have
Mm-hmm.
all this freedom and then we go into prison, we have no freedom.
Yep.
And so what you want to do is make sure you have that V or that triangle so the point is facing downward, meaning children don't have a lot of control. And as they get older, then as the parent, you give them more and more choices. And
Mm-hmm.
I think that's how we teach them how to make good choices. That's how I would prepare is you set the stage for, yeah, the parents are in control and I'm going to teach you how to make good choices. And I'm going to teach you that sometimes your choices have consequences.
Right. Which is
That's
very
a big one.
important.
That's a big
Yes.
one.
Yes. And when I praise my children now, Curtis and I, we try to work very hard on praising or disciplining. We try to focus on the behavior. It's
Right.
and most parents nowadays know this that you don't ever say you're being bad. You
Right.
say you made a bad choice or
Yes,
thank you for making a
exactly.
good choice. That's
That-
critical
I
for
agree with
kids.
that. It is because they aren't bad kids. They're just trying
No.
to figure out what it means to make good choices and bad choices.
Mhm.
There's this book that a chapter, it talks about parenting,
Mhm.
and there's a chapter in it called Why Kids Lie.
Okay.
They really freaks them out, when their kids
Mhm.
start lying. They go, oh, this is terrible. It's a pretty common developmental stage that kids go through. And by the end of the session, I may take a break just to go look about what the title of this book is because it's a good one.
Mhm.
Anyway, kids are going to lie.
Right.
And, you have to expect that because they're experimenting with what does it mean to tell the truth? And it's our job as parents to help them understand what are the consequences of
Mhm.
not being truthful. And so I think the preparation, here it is in a nutshell. We teach our children that they get to make the choices and the choices have consequences.
Right. So I think one of the hardest parts of parents is when they start to lose that control.
Oh, that's really hard. Yeah.
It is.
You haven't
And
been there. You haven't been there yet.
no,
I
I haven't, but I watched my dad go through it and I mean, I remember around the time I started high school, my dad kind of started to freak out, mostly with boys. I mean, I kind of noticed that. I could tell that he was trying to really put all of these extra restrictions.
Mhm.
And I mean,
That
uh,
typically doesn't work that well with adolescents. Did it work well in your family?
no, because I mostly just ignored them. But I
Yeah.
mean, I was already on a course to make good choices. I had a reputation as the goody two shoe in high school, and I went to a really small school, and so everyone knew that. I mean, I was never even invited to a party where there was alcohol. I had it all planned out. I was going to say no to drugs, to alcohol, to cigarettes. I never did because no one
No one ever
offered.
offered.
No, because they they all knew my reputation.
Yeah.
And I think it was more of, my dad was maybe playing around with what boundaries he could impose and what was maybe
Uh-huh.
too much.
Hmm.
But I feel like overall, I was headed down a good path anyways. And, I attributed a lot of that to my parents' strong moral values that they instilled in me. But it was scary for my dad because I was his only girl and
Hmm.
I was always his little girl. And the idea of me dating a boy terrified him.
Yeah, oh, I've been through that. See, I'm about 15 years away from having any teenagers, and so it's been a while. But I think I was very lucky. I had very few issues, and very few times that I had to set some strong boundaries for my teenagers. But that's because I think Lindy and I did that preparation that we talked about. We were fairly, I wouldn't say rigid, but we were, we had
Structured.
good structure. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
We were fairly structured early on, and it really makes a difference. The kids are used to it,
Right.
and it makes it easier when they're 15, 16 to then start making their own choices. Now, I see mostly couples, which our listeners would know, and often what will happen is there are often issues with children and often teenagers. And one of the things I try and do is get the couples together in parenting, because if they're struggling in their relationship, they both love these kids and they
Yes.
both want to do what's best for the kids. And so often it's one of the places where you can get them to start working together as a team. And so I'll talk to couples often about parenting with teenagers. And so it's something that I'm pretty familiar with. And then years ago, Lindy and I both did a group. There was a high school, it doesn't exist anymore, called Granite High School here in Salt Lake City area. And for many years, I did the male group and she did a female group and of adolescents. And so one of the things that really stood out to us is the kids with their parents, because we would talk about what was going on in their homes. The thing that came out the strongest is they wanted to be listened to. They wanted to be understood. They didn't want to be, I don't know, if talked at or told, do this, do that. They wanted more to be heard and understood. And then they often thought that, we heard this often, their parents were not fair.
Okay.
And so kids often have a kind of a heightened sense of fairness. And to be honest, it's pretty easy for parents to fall into that trap of being unfair. For instance, they have some infraction and you're going to be grounded for a month, which, seems pretty unfair to the child. And so those are the two things that stood out to us. And so the communication, and we talked, maybe it was last week. I have such a poor sense of time, but we talked about communication and the 4 steps of listen and understand, have the validation and empathy. And that works really well with teenagers.
Okay.
Because often what happens, kids are going to struggle and they're going to do things that we don't like, or they're going to have friends. Here's a common one. They're going to have friends that we don't approve of. And so one mistake that you can make as a parent is to say, I don't want you to see that group of kids anymore.
Yeah.
And it's almost like an invitation to say,
Do it.
okay, I can do it. But what I try and help parents do is to really go into it and listen to the child and say, tell me what you like about these kids. What do you like about being in this group? Because you have to be able to hear your child and understand them and validate their reasons, even though you may not agree with them, to validate their reasons for, being with, say, that group of friends or making a choice. And it's not until you do that that then they'll be willing to listen to you.
And I want to comment on something that you're saying here, is that in that you avoided the why questions.
I did. Yeah.
And I think that's important with teenagers because they're really good at getting defensive, no matter what.
Right. Why do you want to be with these kids? It'll raise defensiveness immediately. Or if you were to say, what do you like about these kids? They'll answer that.
Yes. Try to genuinely understand, not just like, a drill sergeant trying to, drill information out of them. Come to their level and try to see where they're coming from. And empathy. I mean, empathy is one of our overarching themes of our podcast, and teenagers need it too. So one other thing I want to say that you made me think of when you said you were fortunate with your kids because you were structured early on. Well, my siblings, we were all raised the same. We were raised in the same household. My parents were not as fortunate as you.
Well, you bring up a good point, because kids will make
Agency.
Kids will make their own choices, and we're all
Yes.
different. And
Yeah.
so it is clear, you're right, you can be raised in the same household and have incredibly different outcomes.
Absolutely. And my parents 100% have. I mean, I've got brothers who have made very, very poor life choices that have resulted in prison.
Oh,
You know,
that's very sad.
it is. It's really unfortunate and it's heartbreaking to the whole family, but you can't beat yourself up if your kid makes bad choices when you've done everything you could. And my parents would be the first one to admit that they made mistakes and that they weren't perfect as a parent, but they provided us stability to the best of their ability when we
Mhm,
were kids. We knew we were loved, we always had everything we needed, and they taught us right and wrong. And
mhm.
I have long believed, even before I had my own kids, if you are doing your best to do those three things, your absolute best to
Right.
do those three things, you're doing it right, and the rest is up to them.
Right. I agree. And I think that many, many parents do those things. I think what a lot of parents tend to fall short on is the connecting with, like, how do you connect with a teenager?
Yeah.
And I think I mentioned this last week when we were talking about this next session. And I said, well, one, you have to be willing to stay up till 11 or midnight, because
Uh-huh.
that's when they start being willing to talk. And I found that true. And what, you're ready to go to bed. I'm ready to go to bed when I had teenagers, 10, and they weren't ready to go to bed and they were just getting started. And so you have to adjust in some ways the
Mhm.
expectations so that you meet them on their level. That's when you will be able to connect with them and talk with them. And so I think one of the things that a lot of parents don't do well is they don't put in the effort to really understand their kids. What a lot of parents want to do is just tell them what to do.
Yeah.
Just do this, just do this. And that does not work that well
Mhm.
with teenagers.
No. So I took a parenting skills course a number of years ago. And one of the things that we talked about is kids' different emotional needs at different stages
Mhm,
of
mhm.
development. And
Yeah.
teenagers' emotional need is autonomy. They need to feel separate and to build their own identity. And that can be incredibly hard for parents to accept, particularly if their identity isn't the one that they've tried to shape. And I'm thinking of this from a religious standpoint. And I am sure a lot of our listeners in Utah have been through this, where their teenager will start to question their religious beliefs or maybe
Right.
question their morals. And maybe they even decide they don't believe in something that they've been taught their entire lives. And that can be frightening from a parent. As someone who's deeply religious, I've talked about this with Curtis. We've talked about it and I've imagined it and how I would handle it. And the conclusion that I've come to is that I'm already teaching my kids my religious beliefs now when they're young. If they make that decision when they're older, they're already going to know I disagree with them. And so telling them that they're making a bad choice or that they're choosing wrong or that they're wrong isn't going to sway them. It's not going to change their mind, and it's likely to drive a bigger wedge. Now, I don't think that means you just completely let go of all of your rules and guidelines. I think it's very important, even if your child decides, I no longer want to practice this religion, you say, okay, that's fine, but in this house, you still have to follow these guidelines. But I don't think it's helpful to try to force your child to keep following your religion if it's something they're going to push back against. It seems to me like that's just going to cause friction.
Oh, I agree with you 100%. So the word I would use is individuation, and it's certainly an
Mm-hmm.
adolescent task to individuate from the parents. And so they are exploring different
Mm-hmm.
things, which might be religion, it might be morals. But I'm going to go back to the communication piece. And so if your child doesn't want to go to church, or if they say, I don't believe in this anymore,
Mm-hmm.
I would engage them in the conversation. Okay,
Yeah.
what is it about this that either you don't like or you don't believe? And so, yes, they may know that you don't approve of their choice, but as a parent, you can still, that's the validation. See, you
Yes.
don't have to agree to be able to validate, because it'd be really important to be able to get to the place where you can say to your child, I get it from your perspective. And
Mm-hmm.
you can only do that if you've listened, because then they feel seen, they feel heard. And so I think it's a really critical skill that parents can develop, just that ability to really listen and communicate. Now, here's the other thing I try and help parents understand is that from a brain perspective, we consider adolescence to go till about age 25.
Yep.
And I think a lot of parents, if they leave their church or their religion, it's really
Mm-hmm.
frightening to them. Sometimes I'll see parents where their kids don't want to go to college, and that's really frightening to them.
Yeah.
What I try and help them understand is they're still young and they have many years to change this, and
Mm-hmm.
that they need to go through that process of maturation, which is different for every adolescent. And so just because they leave your religion now
Mm-hmm.
doesn't mean that at 25 or 30 they might not then wander back in,
Yeah.
or if they choose to not pursue a higher education and you want them to, it doesn't mean that in 5 years they might not think, oh, okay, I'll go do that. I
Mm-hmm.
think that you have to be willing to let them mature at their own pace.
Mm-hmm.
But again, it's going to be easier if you have good communication, good connection with them, if they feel like you really want to know their world.
Yeah.
That's the key, I think.
Right. And so, from a religious standpoint, I think parents would be really hesitant, like you said, to engage their kids of why, because validation is going to feel a lot like agreeing with them.
That is
And
true. Yes.
you can't think of it like that because you've taught them their entire life. At least my parents did. My parents taught me my entire life what they believe in. I knew, and I'm doing the same thing with my kids. My kids are going to know. And so if they come to me and they say, well, this doesn't sit right with me, I disagree with this, rather than just saying, but this is the way it is, like, this is
Right.
truth. I'm older. I know this. Just trust me. You've got to engage with them and say, okay, well, tell me about it. That doesn't mean that that's what you believe, but it's so important to validate their concerns to help them learn and grow and find out their own truth.
See, but I think you can easily engage in that conversation and be
Mm-hmm.
able to validate your child's position and then say, but I have different beliefs and I think
Yes.
about
Mm-hmm.
this in a different way. So you can also reinforce this idea as a parent. We think
Yes.
of it in a different way. So
Mm-hmm.
yes, you can validate and you can also say, this is what I believe.
Yeah. I think those are really important steps to helping children find themselves as they age and as they mature. So I'd like to share a couple instances where I feel like my dad really did it right. And the first time I was a freshman in high school, and my dad had very clear dating standards in what was appropriate. And I was just out with some friends late one night. I think it was right before a volleyball game or something like that. And I was riding around on the handlebars of this guy's bike, and he was much older than me, and he had his arm around me, and we were kind of cuddly, and I felt really uncomfortable. And I remember in my 14-year-old mind, terrified that my dad was somehow going to find out about it. I don't think he ever would have, but I was terrified that he was going to somehow find out what had happened. And so I just went to him and I told him what happened. And I was expecting him to be so mad at me. And he didn't get mad at all. I was expecting punishment. I was expecting him to take me out of volleyball and to start imposing all these restrictions. And he didn't. Instead, he just talked to me about, this is why I've set the guidelines and the rules that I do. And this is the dangers. And he recognized that I recognized it. And he respected that. And from then on, I was never afraid to come to him when I did something wrong, because I knew it would be better if I went to him rather than him finding it out on his own.
See, and I think that's what you want to cultivate as a
Yes.
parent.
Mm-hmm.
And so you're absolutely right that the anger, if we go to anger too quickly
Yeah.
as parents, then what it does, it makes it much less likely that our
Mm-hmm.
kids are going to come to us. And at least from my perspective, and I think from a lot of parents' perspective, you really want that. You want to create that type of relationship where your kids will come to you when
Mm-hmm.
they need to. And so here's one of my stories. My oldest son was 17. He went to a party. I remember it was probably around Christmas, and it was with his school buddies, and I think there was a pretty large crowd. And so there was drinking
Mm-hmm.
going on. But what happened is one of the kids at the party decided to have a dramatic event, and I don't know, probably cut themselves or something and was
Oh
lying
no.
on the front lawn. And so it was dramatic. This person was never in danger.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, the police got called. So people were running and, because here they were underage and
Yep.
drinking.
Yep.
But my son was, two of his buddies were just standing on the lawn. They didn't run. So I didn't get mad about it. But what I did is I said, you know what, you're going to have to pay to figure this out and get an
Mm-hmm.
attorney to represent you. And so I made him do that, and I made him find an attorney and made him pay for it. I was there along the way to help out, but
Mm-hmm.
he had to solve it, and he did. And
Yeah.
eventually whatever happened got expunged. But just the consequence is, okay, you made this choice.
Mm-hmm.
Now you've got to, do what you need to do to solve it. So I think the anger, that's really an important point, Liz, that what happens is when we get angry, then the attention shifts from whatever the issue is
Yep.
to the anger.
Mm-hmm.
And that becomes the focus. And it's very hard it might be impossible for our kids to hear us
Yeah.
because they're just tuned into the anger. And they
Mm-hmm.
might even say, why are you so angry? Why are you getting mad? Whereas if you can, if you have the clear expectations and the consequences, you don't have to get angry.
Yep.
And you can say, you're going to solve this. I'll help you, but you're going to solve it, whatever
Yeah.
it is.
Right. And I think putting the responsibility into their own hands at a young age is crucial. Teach them, even as a teenager, actions have consequences. And if you're going to make a choice, then that's going to be on you. My dad made no qualms about that. I mean, he told us, from a young age, I'm not harboring a fugitive. If you do something wrong, I'll be the first one to rat you out.
Yeah. Right.
And he was always very clear about that. We were a law-abiding family. Another time that I feel like my dad really handled it right, one of my younger brothers first got in trouble with the law in high school, and I won't go into details about what he did. And so as a result, he was on probation. Well, it was the end of a year party, and he got drunk with a bunch of his friends. And I picked him up on the way home, and I had debated whether or not I should tell my parents or not. Well, he took the choice out of my hands when he started puking all down the hallway and woke them up. And so I was like, well, you're on your own, dude. I was going to at least wait until morning so we don't have hot heads while you're drunk, but sorry, you're on your own now. Anyways, and I was really impressed again with the way my dad handled it because he said, here's your consequence. Call your probation officer and tell him what you did. And he handed him the phone and he made him make that call. And I was like, yeah, that's really smart. That makes a lot of sense. So one thing about teenagers that we have to remember, you said that adolescence often goes into 25. Your prefrontal cortex is the decision-making part of your brain. It does not fully develop until the age of 25.
Right.
So,
executive function.
yes. And that's why teenagers make
Make
notoriously
poor choices.
yes, because their brains are underdeveloped, literally. So I have heard stories of parents wanting to introduce alcohol to their kids under their own supervision as a teenager. I would highly caution against that. I think that's extremely irresponsible, and it's also illegal.
It's problematic because one, alcohol does have a very negative effect on brain development.
Yes.
So, if especially for adolescents, and once you're, over the age of 25, then the effect of alcohol and the brain isn't developing the way it was. So it's not the same. So from my perspective, if you're going to introduce them to alcohol, one, you're giving them a message that this is okay. And I think that we want to be able to give them the message that the consequences are it's going to affect your brain development and you may make decisions that you'll regret. So I think that a lot of it is to give them the consequences. Now, one of the things that'll happen is you can't control them when, you can't keep them locked up in your house. And so
exactly.
often they're going to go drink anyway.
Hmm.
And so, as we've talked, and your dad, is a perfect example of this, is you have to be able to say, here are the consequences for
Yeah.
your behavior. I also think it's really important for parents to set up the option that to say to your kids, I don't want you to drink. I don't want you to get drunk. If you do drink, I don't want you to drive. I will
Yes.
come get you. And so you make it a safety issue. And most parents would say, I promise I won't get angry. Now, if you promise that,
You have to
don't
follow
get
through.
don't get angry
Yes.
because this is a safety issue. You don't want
Hmm.
your kid, even with one drink, getting in a car and
Yeah.
driving. And so, given that you can't control what
Hmm.
they do, you have to give them the options to be safe. Now, the same thing happens with sexuality often. And again, I think it's problematic to become sexually active at such a young age.
Yeah.
That's a whole, probably another episode. But
Hmm.
I also think that you have to be able to help them be safe because what you don't want is a pregnancy or
Yeah.
an STD.
Hmm.
And so you have to be clear about what are the options. I don't want you to do this, but you have to be safe. And
Yeah.
and so I think if we set those expectations for safety, because as you just said, adolescents don't make good choices
No.
often. They make
Yeah.
terrible choices.
Yes, yeah, it's part of the teenage experience. So a couple of things that I have heard that I thought would be good is giving your children a safe out. And I've heard of parents who have said if there's something going on and you're uncomfortable with it, what you can do is you can text me a code word and I will
Sure.
call you and tell you I need you home for
Yeah,
some reason.
sure.
Or you can even just say, if you're uncomfortable with what's going on, you can text me and ask me to come get you. No questions asked.
Right.
I will be there. And
Yeah, I agree with that.
they put the caveat in there that if someone else's life is in danger, then you need to recognize that and
Mhm.
and make the right call. But give your kids a safety net, provide it for them. But the hardest part is going to be to follow through, I think, with not getting angry or not asking questions, because I would imagine there's going to be a burning curiosity. What was going on at that party? But if you
Right.
say something to your kids, you have to follow through.
You have to, because that builds trust and you
Hmm.
want them to trust you. And that goes back to, what we just talked about. You want them to come to you. You want them
Yes.
to text you. You want them to call you if
Hmm.
something's going on. And the only way they'll do that is if they trust you to do what you said you would.
Yeah. So, I mean, just explain it early on. I will be your
Mhm.
safety net. I will
Yeah.
be your safe place. If you are doing something wrong and consequences need to happen, let them know that you're not just going to give them a free pass. But in that moment, whatever you need to get out of, we can talk about consequences later if very well.
Safety first. I mean, I think it's safety first, and then we'll deal with it.
Yes. Yeah. Safety first and just make your home the safe harbor for your kids. Give them
Right.
a safe place.
That's right. I agree with that. And so the way to do that, and again, I know I'm repeating myself, but I really want listeners to understand it's all about the connection and the communication and
Hmm.
your willingness to really listen to your adolescents and understand their world.
Yeah.
That's how they trust you with it.
Hmm. And it can be hard, and not all teenagers are going to comply. Some teenagers are just, you
Right.
can do everything you can and they're just going to say because.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
mean,
No, I agree. That's right. They'll make their own choices. And
yeah.
I think even here's the thing that parents can look forward to. So all my kids are adults. My
Hmm.
youngest is 31, my oldest is 41. And still our children will make choices that we are unhappy with.
Hmm.
But they're individuals, it's their life. So
Yeah. And if you want a healthy relationship with them as an adult, you have to set the
start,
precedent that they're going
start
to
when
make
they're
their.
5.
Yes. They're going to make their own choices, and
That's right.
you have to accept that as an adult, or sorry, as when they're teenagers, definitely enforce consequences if they make poor choices, but you still have to accept that they are going to make their own choices.
Yes. I found the book. Do you remember
Okay.
earlier I was mentioning a book? This is a
Yeah.
great book for parents. It's called NutureShock.
Okay.
The author, I guess you say it Poe, it's P-O. Poe Bronson is the
Okay.
author.
Okay.
And there is a chapter specifically, well, it's all about kids and raising kids, but there's one specifically about lying that I think is really
Okay.
quite interesting.
Okay. I will have that book linked in our show notes. Next week is going to be another fabulous episode. We are going to get into a spectacular listener story. I mean, I don't know if I want to be too corny and call it a love story, but it kind of is.
Yeah, it is, which is nice.
Yeah,
It
yeah.
has a good ending.
It does. It has a good ending, but it's this couple that I know that went through a really tough time in their marriage and they've come out on top. So stay tuned for that. We will have that next week. And in the meantime, have a good week, everyone.
Have a good week, everyone.
Have a question for Dr. Burton? How about a topic you'd like us to cover? Send us an email at mentalhealthpod21@gmail.com. This podcast was produced and edited by Liz Lang. Music is by Audio Lounge.